My family kicked me out of my basement to give it to my loser brother. I left without warning, and now they lost their house without my money, and they're begging me to come back. I'm 26 years old. I work as a project manager, and I need to tell this story because I basically just cut ties with my entire family after years of being treated like an ATM with legs. I guess I should start from the beginning. When I was like 18 and started working full-time while my brother Ryan, 2 years younger than me, was still at home not doing much more than playing video games and dreaming about being an entrepreneur. I don't know exactly when I became the responsible son and he became the golden child. But by the time we hit our 20s, the roles were already super defined. You know, I was the one paying the bills, and he was the one getting all the emotional and financial support from my parents, no matter how badly things went for him in life. The thing is that for years, like since I left college, I've been helping out financially at home. I paid rent for living in my parents' basement. Sure, but I also covered part of the household expenses, bought groceries, helped with repairs, basically whatever they needed. And, don't get me wrong, at first it didn't bother me that much, because I thought that's what families do. You support each other and all that. But while I was working my 40 hours a week and sometimes more, Ryan was trying one business after another, and when I say trying, I mean spectacularly failing. But my parents always defended him, saying he was an entrepreneur and just needed to find his path. Looking back, I should have seen it coming. All the signs were there that eventually this was going to blow up in my face. Ryan married Jessica when he was 22. She was 24 too now, and they had 2 kids, Lucas and Emma, super fast. And look, I have nothing against kids, but Ryan could barely support himself and decided to start a family of 4. My parents were happy. My mom especially couldn't stop talking about how mature and responsible Ryan was for settling down so young. And I was thinking, seriously? The guy who just closed his 3rd, failed business is the example of maturity? But whatever. I stayed in my basement, working, paying my bills, not causing problems, like the invisible son who only shows up when something needs fixing or paying. About a year ago, Ryan opened an electronics repair shop. Honestly, I thought maybe this time it would work out because at least he had some technical knowledge. He'd taken some courses and everything. My parents were super excited. My dad lent him money for the space. My mom helped him by watching the kids so he could focus on the business. Jessica, his wife, was constantly posting on social media about how proud she was of her entrepreneur husband, with photos of the shop and everything. I supported them too, helped them move equipment, lent them money for some initial inventory, like $2,000 that to this day I haven't seen back, but that's not the main point of this story. So, the business started well the first few months, or at least that's what they said, but turns out Ryan wasn't that good with the administrative part. He didn't keep good records, did repairs but didn't charge enough to cover costs, and basically in less than a year the business was in the red. By the time it hit its first anniversary, he already owed rent on the space, suppliers were charging him, and things looked bad. My parents, instead of letting him face the consequences, started throwing more money at it. But it was like pouring water into a bucket with holes. It just didn't work. And then the inevitable happened. About 6 months ago, Ryan had to close the shop. He didn't declare formal bankruptcy or anything, just closed the doors and left a bunch of debts behind. Jessica was devastated. My parents were super worried, and I honestly felt bad for them because losing a business isn't easy. I get it. But what happened next is where everything went to hell. Ryan and Jessica had been renting a small apartment, and with the business closed, they couldn't pay rent anymore. They had some savings, but they were running out fast. And my parents decided the obvious solution was for them to move back home with them. Here comes the part where my life becomes a nightmare. One Sunday afternoon, my mom calls me to the basement and tells me she needs to talk to me. I go up, and there are both my parents in the living room, with those serious faces you make when you're going to give bad news. My mom starts with the speech about how Ryan is going through a difficult time, that he has 2 small children, that they need family help, all of which I already knew and wasn't surprised by. But then she drops the bomb. Ryan and his family are going to move into the basement. My basement, the one I'd been renting and paying for religiously for almost 5 years, and I have to move to the little craft room upstairs. I sat there, trying to process what I'd just heard. The craft room, literally, was a space about 10 feet by 10 feet, where my mom kept her sewing and painting stuff. It didn't have its own closet. The window faced directly into the neighbor's yard like 5 feet away, and it definitely wasn't a living space. I told them that didn't make sense, that I was paying rent, that I had my established space, that I worked from home several days a week and needed a decent place. My dad interrupted me and said, Ryan needed the basement because he has a family to support, that I'm just one person and can adapt to a smaller space, and that besides it would only be temporary until Ryan recovered financially. I asked them how long temporary was, and my mom said they didn't know exactly, maybe a few months. I told them that wasn't fair, that I'd been a responsible tenant, that I always paid on time, that I helped around the house, and they were displacing me like I didn't matter. My mom started with the classic emotional manipulation, saying she couldn't believe I was being so selfish, that Ryan was my brother and had small children. How could I be so insensitive to his situation? My dad added that they owned the house and could do whatever they wanted, and if I didn't like it, I could look for another place. But when I told him, okay, then I'm going to find an apartment, my mom panicked and said no. That would be abandoning the family in a difficult time, that they needed me to stay and help. You see what I mean? It was a lose-lose situation. If I stayed, I lost my space and comfort. If I left, I was the bad guy abandoning his family. I decided to stay because honestly I thought maybe it really would be temporary, that in a couple months Ryan would get a job and they'd move out. It was the worst decision I've made in my life, or at least one of the worst. The move happened on a Friday. Ryan showed up with a rented truck full of his stuff, and I had to get all my belongings out of the basement in basically one day. I moved my bed, my desk, my clothes, everything to the little room upstairs, and believe me when I tell you barely anything fit. I had to stack boxes because there was no storage space. My desk ended up literally against the bed, and I had to leave my clothes in suitcases because there was no closet. Meanwhile, Ryan and Jessica were settling into my space with their 2 kids, setting up cribs, putting toys everywhere, and my parents were happily helping them get settled like it was the most normal thing in the world. The first few weeks were horrible. The little room had no sound insulation, so I heard absolutely everything that happened in the house. The kids cried, screamed, ran around, and I was trying to work from home with headphones at full volume to concentrate. But the worst part was that I had no privacy, literally zero. My mom would come into the room without knocking because technically it was still her craft space, so I could be on a work video call and she'd open the door to look for something among her things. I asked her to please knock before entering and she got offended, saying it was her house, and she didn't have to ask permission to enter her own spaces. Plus, Jessica started using the kitchen like it was a restaurant, cooking for her family and leaving everything dirty, using my stuff from the fridge without asking, and when I'd say something, my mom would come out defending her, saying she was stressed, taking care of 2 small children. Lucas and Emma's toys started appearing all over the house, including in the hallway outside my room, and I was constantly dodging toy cars and dolls to get to the bathroom. The food I bought would disappear from the fridge, and when I'd ask, my mom would say it was for the kids, not to be selfish with 2 small children. About a month after they moved in, I was at my limit. I'd had a heavy week at work, needed to concentrate to finish an important project, and the kids were running up and down the house, screaming like it was an amusement park. I went down and asked Ryan, very politely, if he could please keep the kids a little quieter, because I was working. Ryan looked at me like I'd asked him something ridiculous and said they were kids. They made noise, and if I didn't like it, I could go work at a coffee shop. I told him I paid rent in this house and had the right to a reasonably quiet environment to work, and he laughed and said he didn't pay rent because he was in a difficult situation, but that I'd always been the family favorite for being responsible and hardworking, so I should stop complaining. That set me off. Honestly, I told him how dare he say I was the favorite when my parents had literally kicked me out of my space to give him the basement, when they'd never supported me in anything the way they constantly supported him. We started arguing louder. Jessica came out of the basement to defend him. My mom appeared from who knows where and started yelling at me about how dare I talk to my brother like that when he was going through a difficult time. My dad came home from work in the middle of all the drama and automatically took their side, telling me I was selfish, that I only thought about myself, that I didn't understand what it was like to have real responsibilities like a family. I went to my room, closed the door, and sat on the bed trying not to explode. I felt like my chest was going to burst from frustration. I'd spent years helping this family, paying my bills, being responsible, and they treated me like I was the problem. That night I decided I needed to get out of there, but I didn't have enough savings for a complete apartment because all my money went to helping at home. Yes, I paid rent, but I also bought groceries, paid utilities, helped with repairs, basically subsidized the whole family. The next week, something happened that made me really see how things were. I went to the supermarket early on a Saturday to buy some things, and as I was leaving, I saw Ryan and Jessica at the jewelry store in the mall. I didn't greet them because they were focused on looking at something. So I approached curious, and turns out they were looking at bracelets and earrings. And Jessica was trying on a designer purse that easily cost about $300. I stood there in shock, watching Ryan pull out his credit card to pay for the purse. This guy who was supposedly broke, who couldn't pay rent, who my parents had to rescue, was buying his wife unnecessary luxuries. I didn't say anything to them at the moment, because honestly, I didn't even know what to say. I went back home and started thinking about all the times my mom had asked me for money to lend to them. All the times they'd said they didn't have money for diapers or formula for the kids. And turns out they had money for $300 purses. That night I mentioned to my mom that I'd seen them at the mall, and she immediately got defensive, saying maybe Jessica had saved that money, that I shouldn't be judging what they spent on, that it wasn't my business. I told her it was my business when I was subsidizing their stay in the house and they were spending on luxuries, and she told me to stop being bitter and resentful. Things kept getting worse. I started looking for options to move out, but apartments in the area were expensive. I needed to save for the deposit and first month's rent, and meanwhile, I was trapped in that horrible little room. My mental health was being affected. I wasn't sleeping well because the kids would wake up at night and I'd hear them crying through the walls. I couldn't work well because there were constant interruptions, and I felt like I was losing my mind. About 2 months into being in the room, I had an important video call with a client, and I'd specifically asked my family to please keep the noise down during that hour. I had a sign on my door that said, "On call, please be quiet." 10 minutes after starting the call, I hear knocks on my door. My mom opens without waiting for a response and comes in saying she needs to look for some scissors among her things. I made desperate signals that I was on a call, but she ignored me and started looking through the boxes, making noise. I had to apologize to the client, turn off my camera, and practically beg my mom to leave. When I finished the call, I went downstairs furious and told her I couldn't continue like this, that I needed respect and privacy. She said, I was ungrateful, that I was living in her house, that if I didn't like it, I should leave. And you know what? That's exactly what I did. That same afternoon, I started looking for options and found a resort that rented rooms by the week at a reasonable price. It wasn't ideal, but it was better than being in that house. The next day, which was Friday, I took the essentials, put clothes and my laptop in a suitcase, and told my parents I was going to stay somewhere else for a while because I needed space. My mom got hysterical, saying how could I abandon them like that? What would the family think? That I was being dramatic. My dad said if I left, not to count on them for anything, that I was showing my true selfish character. Ryan appeared and said something like he'd always known I wasn't really a good brother, that I only helped to feel superior. I left without saying anything else. I got to the resort, a small but clean place with air conditioning and a decent bed, and I literally threw myself on the bed and cried. I don't remember the last time I'd cried like that, but everything came out at once. Years of frustration, of feeling used, of being treated like a second-class citizen in my own family. I stayed there that weekend, turned off my phone, and tried to process everything. Monday, I went back to work in person, and when I turned on my phone, I had like 47 messages from my mom, 23 from my dad, several from Ryan, and even some from aunts and uncles asking what had happened. Most were messages blaming me, telling me I was destroying the family, that my parents were devastated, that Ryan and Jessica were worried about me. Yeah, right. But what ended up convincing me that all this was crazy was a message from my mom saying she hoped I'd continue paying my share of rent and food even though I wasn't living there, because they were counting on that money. Seriously? They wanted me to pay rent for a room I wasn't living in, where I didn't even have all my stuff, and to also keep buying groceries for a family that didn't even respect me. I sent them a simple message. I'm not going to pay for a place where I don't live and where I was treated like garbage. I expected them to explode, and they didn't disappoint me. My dad called me screaming, literally screaming over the phone, saying I was a disgrace as a son, that after everything they'd done for me, this is how I repaid them, that I was leaving my brother and his kids in a horrible situation. I asked him how exactly I was leaving them in a horrible situation. If Ryan had the whole basement to himself, wasn't paying rent, and had their complete support. My dad said, they were counting on my money to be able to support them, that I knew they couldn't do it alone, and that it was my responsibility as part of the family to help. I told him that helping was one thing, but being exploited was another, and that I wasn't going to keep financing their decision to constantly rescue Ryan. The conversation got worse when Ryan grabbed the phone and started telling me I'd always been bitter, that I was jealous that he had a family, and I didn't. That's why I was being so cruel. I told him it had nothing to do with jealousy, that it had to do with years of watching them use me while rescuing him from every bad decision he made. He told me that at least he'd had the guts to try being an entrepreneur, that I was just a conformist employee working for others, and that I didn't understand what it was really like to struggle. I laughed, literally laughed, and told him he didn't know what struggling was because he'd never had to face real consequences, that there was always someone there to get him out of trouble. I hung up the phone and blocked him. I blocked my mom too. My dad sent me one last message saying I was dead to them, not to come looking for them again. And honestly, at that moment, I felt more relieved than sad. I blocked his number too. I thought that would be the end of it, but oh no. The extended family had other plans. About 3 days later, I got a call from my Aunt Marta, my mom's sister, saying they needed to have a family meeting to resolve this. I told her there was nothing to resolve, that I'd made my decision. She insisted, said it was important, that the family was falling apart because of me. I agreed to go just to make things clear once and for all. The meeting was at my parents' house on a Saturday. I arrived and there were like 15 people there, aunts, uncles, cousins, my parents, Ryan and Jessica, all sitting in the living room looking at me like I was the defendant in a trial. My Aunt Marta started saying this meeting was to help me understand the damage I was causing. That family was the most important thing, that I couldn't just abandon my responsibilities. Other relatives started adding their opinions. One said, I'd always been the weird one in the family, another that it was obvious I had empathy problems. My cousin said she was embarrassed by how I was treating Ryan and his kids. I sat there listening for like 20 minutes without saying anything. Nobody asked for my version. Nobody asked how I felt. Nobody mentioned the years I'd been helping financially. It was simply a coordinated attack to make me feel guilty and get me to return to my role as silent provider. When they finally let me speak, I asked them if any of them knew how much money I'd put into that house in the last 5 years. Silence. I asked them if any of them knew they'd displaced me to a 10x10 room, while Ryan had the whole basement without paying anything. Some uncomfortable murmurs. I asked them why none of them were, offering to help Ryan if they cared so much. My uncle Roberto said, that was different, that I lived there so it was my responsibility. I told him I didn't live there anymore, that I'd left precisely because I couldn't take it anymore, and that I wasn't going to keep financing Ryan's irresponsibility. My dad stood up red with rage and yelled at me to get out of his house, that he didn't want to see me again. I stood up, looked at all of them, and told them it was incredible how an entire family could turn against one person just for refusing to continue being exploited. I left and never went back. The following days were crazy with messages from different relatives, all telling me variations of the same thing, that I was selfish, that I'd abandoned my family, that I was going to regret it. I blocked almost everyone. I kept living at the resort for a couple more weeks while looking for a decent apartment and saving enough for the deposit. But Ryan couldn't let it go. He started posting, on social media, vague posts about toxic family members and people who abandon those who need them most, obviously directed at me. His friends commented supportive things without knowing the real story. Jessica shared the posts with her own comments about how some people only think about themselves. It was ridiculous, But it also bothered me because people who knew both of us started asking me what had happened. I decided to call Ryan directly and tell him to stop the social media drama. He answered with that victim voice he uses when he wants sympathy and told me he was just expressing his feelings about a difficult situation. I told him to stop playing victim, that he knew perfectly well why I'd left, and that if he wanted to move on with his life, then to stop dragging me on social media. He told me I'd abandoned my family, that his kids asked about me, which I highly doubted because those kids barely knew me, and that someday I was going to regret this. I told him the only thing I regretted was not leaving years earlier, and hung up. About a week after that, Ryan showed up at my work. My work. He arrived at reception, asking to see me, saying it was urgent. Luckily, my boss called me first to ask if I wanted them to let him up, and I said no, to please tell him I wasn't available. My boss, who already knew a bit about the family situation because I'd told him when I asked to work more days from home, went down personally and told Ryan he couldn't show up like that at my workplace, that if he had something to talk to me about, he could call me or send me a message. Ryan waited in the parking lot until I left work. I approached because it was obvious he wasn't going to leave until we talked. He confronted me, saying I was a coward, that I couldn't even face him face to face, that I was hiding behind my work. I told him I had nothing to talk to him about, that he and the rest of the family had made it super clear how they felt about me. He told me Mom was devastated, that Dad had blood pressure problems from stress, that I was destroying the family. I asked him where that concern was when they kicked me out of my space to accommodate them, when they used my stuff without permission, when they treated me like household staff. He had no answer for that. So he continued with personal attacks, saying I'd never understood what it was like to have real responsibilities, that it was easy for me to judge from my solitary life without a family of my own. That hurt because, honestly, part of the reason I hadn't started my own family was because all my time and money went to maintaining theirs. But I wasn't going to give him the satisfaction of seeing me affected. I told him I'd made my decision, that I wasn't going to change my mind, and to please stop looking for me. He tried to block my way when I headed to my car, but I moved around him and left. That night I changed my phone number, only gave the new one to close friends and my work. But my mom, oh my God, my mom decided to escalate things to a completely new level. About 2 days after that, my boss called me to his office with a confused face and told me he'd received a call from a woman claiming to be my mother, asking about me, saying I needed time off from work because I was having a mental crisis. My boss obviously didn't give her any information, but asked me if everything was okay, if I needed to talk about something. I had to explain, super embarrassed, that my family was trying to sabotage my life because I refused to continue being their unlimited money source and to please ignore any calls from them in the future. My boss was incredibly understanding, said he'd seen similar situations before, not to worry, and that if I needed anything, not to hesitate to ask. But I was furious. I called my mom from the office phone because she didn't have my new number and told her how dare she call my work trying to make me look crazy. She started crying, saying she was worried about me, that I clearly wasn't thinking clearly, that I needed professional help. I told her the only one who needed help was her for not being able to accept that her son had established boundaries and that if she contacted my work or anyone in my professional life again, I was going to consider legal action. I hung up and blocked the office number for calls from unsaved numbers. I finally got a decent apartment, a one-bedroom place in a quiet complex about 40 minutes from where my parents lived. I moved with the help of 2 friends from work. We got pizza and beer afterwards, and for the first time in months, I felt at peace. I had almost no furniture. Slept on an air mattress the first few weeks, but it was my space. Nobody was going to come in without permission. Nobody was going to use my stuff. Nobody was going to wake me up with kids screaming at 6 inches the morning. I sent one last message to my parents from my new number saying something like, "This is the last time you're going to crease. I hear from me. I've decided to take permanent distance from this family. Don't look for me. Don't contact me. Respect my decision. I hope you find a way to solve your problems without using me as a bank. Take care." And I blocked them immediately. Of course, they didn't respect that. Messages started appearing from relatives who had never shown interest in my life, all with the same message that I was cruel, that I was being selfish, that family is forever, that mom was heartbroken. I blocked them one by one. My cousin Daniel, who'd always been somewhat decent to me, sent me a more neutral message asking if I really wanted to cut all ties, saying he understood I was angry, but maybe it was too drastic. I responded, explaining a bit more of the situation. The years of exploitation, the displacement, the lack of respect. He said he didn't know it had been so serious, that my parents had painted the story completely differently to the family, making it seem like I'd simply gotten angry because I didn't want to help Ryan. I thanked him for listening but told him my decision was made. About 3 weeks after moving out, Ryan tried one last desperate move. I don't know how he got my direct boss's number, but he called pretending to be a recruiter asking about my work performance and reliability, trying to get information or who knows what. Luckily, my boss is very smart, and something about the call didn't sit right with him, so he investigated the number and discovered it was from the city where my family lived. He called me to ask about it, and I told him everything. Absolutely everything, the complete story. My boss was shocked, said he'd never seen such a toxic family, and assured me they were going to block any communication from that area that wasn't from verified clients. I thought they'd eventually get tired of trying to contact me, but they kept insisting for months. Messages on social media from accounts I didn't know. Mutual friends asking if I was okay because the family was worried, even a couple times seeing a car that looked like my dad's near my apartment, though I'm not 100% sure it was him. I was becoming paranoid, checking over my shoulder constantly, had developed terrible anxiety. I decided to look for therapy, and it was the best thing I could have done. My therapist helped me understand that what I'd experienced was emotional and financial abuse, that establishing boundaries didn't make me selfish, that it was completely valid to cut contact with toxic people, even if they were family. I started to really heal. To understand that none of what had happened was my fault, that I wasn't responsible for Ryan's bad decisions or my parents' inability to stop rescuing him. About 6 months passed without real contact with them. I'd stopped obsessively checking social media, had blocked every form of communication, was focusing on my work and my mental health. My life was quiet, boring even, but in a good way. I went out with friends, had started casually dating someone, was saving real money for the first time in years because I didn't have to support an entire family. Then, my cousin Daniel called me. It was weird because we hadn't talked in months, but I answered. He said he wanted to give me a heads up about something that had happened. Turns out Ryan and my parents had been evicted from the house. Apparently, without my financial contribution, they couldn't maintain the house and the expenses that came with having Ryan, Jessica, and the kids living there. They fell behind on mortgage payments, my parents took out loans to cover expenses, and eventually everything collapsed. They had to sell the house for less than it was worth to cover the debts, and now my parents were living in a small 2-bedroom apartment, and Ryan. Well, Ryan had moved back in with Jessica's parents because she'd left him. Yes, Jessica left him. Apparently after they lost the house, Ryan tried another business with money they didn't have, failed again, and Jessica decided enough was enough. She took the kids and went to her parents, started divorce proceedings and everything. Ryan was living with them too temporarily, but the relationship with his in-laws was tense because they blamed Ryan for ruining their daughter's life. When Daniel told me all this, I felt nothing. Maybe a tiny bit of satisfaction at the irony of it all, but mainly nothing. I didn't feel sorry. I didn't feel like helping. I didn't feel the need to contact them. Daniel told me my parents wanted to talk to me, that they wanted to apologize and fix things. I told him I had no interest, that they'd had months to reflect on their actions before the consequences caught up with them, and that now that things were bad for them, I wasn't going to come running back to rescue them. Several months have passed since then. I'm in a much better place mentally and emotionally. I moved to a bigger apartment, 2 bedrooms, because I got a promotion at work. I have a decent social life. I'm still in therapy. I started going to the gym, and I feel like I'm finally living for myself and not for others. Sometimes I wonder if I did the right thing, if I was too harsh. But then I remember the 10x10 room. I remember how I felt trapped and used. And I know I made the right decision for me. My family probably tells a different version of this story, where I'm the villain who abandoned them in their time of greatest need. And that's okay. They can believe whatever they want. I know my truth. I know what I lived through. And I know that establishing those boundaries probably saved me from ending up completely destroyed emotionally and financially. I don't know if I'll ever have contact with them again. Honestly, I don't see it happening soon. But I also don't completely rule out the possibility in a very distant future if they really change and acknowledge what they did. For now, I'm fine focusing on building my own life, surrounding myself with people who value me, and learning to put my needs first without feeling guilty about it.